תודה רבה שבאתם. אני אתחיל להציג את האורח שלנו היום. And we will hold the conversation in English. So, Dr. Daniel Milman is a clinical psychologist based in Tel Aviv and the member of the Institute of the Parisian Society of Psychoanalysis. After earning his MBA in finance, Milman studied psychology, eventually receiving a PhD from the University of Paris and simultaneously training as a psychoanalyst. From 2003 to 2009, he worked as a child psychotherapist at the Salpêtrière in Paris, and he is also a board member of the CCA, thanks to his interest in art and his expertise on the dialectic between art and psychoanalysis. Throughout my research on the topic of hysteria, I had been in contact with him, and our regular exchange helped me to process the works enormously. Therefore, it was my wish to involve Dr. Daniel Milman in the exhibition program, and I'm very happy that he is able to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to start with the questions already?
Yes.
No, first I want to thank you.
Okay.
I really appreciate the opportunity you're giving me, and it was a pleasure, these conversations we had.
Vice versa. Yeah, thank you.
So now hit me.
All right. So, do you remember the first time you heard of hysteria? And do you recall the circumstances and what thoughts you had in mind when you heard about it?
I think the first time it's because I was designated as hysterical, as an hysterical child. I was very negative with discipline. And so, you know, I was called an hysterical child.
I didn't know that. You didn't share it with me.
Well, you know, I have to keep some surprises. It was a surprise for me too. And by the way, you're asking me, I didn't know what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean, hysterical? You know, I was like 7.
And how was the topic addressed with your studies? As you started to study clinical psychology in 1995, and what has changed since then within the professional field?
Well, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay. Psychology is taught in France, in Paris, essentially in 3 universities. One is Nanterre, which is of Lacanian influence. One is Paris 1, which is under the influence of cognitive psychology. And the third one is Paris 7, which still is, but with fragility, psychoanalysis, Freudian oriented. Mm-hmm. So I went to that one. So my learning of hysteria was based on this point of view. Mm-hmm. I was taught how Freud, you know, came to be familiar with hysteria and his definition and his interaction with Charcot at the Salpêtrière. So this is how I was taught. I was also taught that it's not something that is to be found commonly anymore in contemporary society. Mm-hmm. That it was a group that existed only at the time of Freud. It was the result of a certain society.
Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate about that a little bit?
Well, in the 19th century, the bourgeoisie came to exist. And to be bourgeois means, in fact, to have time. You're not only surviving, and you have money. And the women were told to stay at home and only, you know, care about the home, the housewife, Hausfrau. The man, it was a different story. Going to the brothel was a very accepted thing. Fathers were taking their boys to the brothel for their first sexual experience. So they had variety in their sexual lives. If in spite of that they were uncontrollable, they could go either to church, become priests, or to the army, become soldiers. Women had no solution. Women were at home. They had to deal with this situation. They had to deal with low frequency of sexual interaction, and hysteria developed as a consequence of that. So it is not a surprise that in our contemporary society, which has evolved the frequency, the prevalence of hysteria has dropped significantly. What we have now are different kind of pathologies. So it's part of the history, if you want, of psychoanalysis. It's very important because the fundamental finding of Freud was to say there is a symptom and the symptom has a meaning. Charcot at the Salpêtrière had already shown that there was no organic cause to hysteria. So he was working on what could it be, etc. Initially he thought it was sex also, but then he went away from that.
And also thought it was neurological.
That's after.
Okay.
But initially he thought it was sex, and there was a party at the house of Charcot in Paris where Freud was invited, and Charcot said to Freud, "C'est la chose." It is the thing, the cause. So he meant sex. So that's basically, so the idea of Freud was to say the symptom has a meaning. Our objective is not to extinguish it, our objective is to understand it. That was movement number one. Movement number two was that he was confronted with women who were suffering.
Who? Charcot?
No, Freud.
Okay, yeah.
Charcot also, but within the hospital, and
Yeah.
that's a different story. But Freud was confronted with women who were suffering, and one of these women, I think it's Bertha von Pappenheim, who is called Anna O in the texts on Hysteria, said to Freud, "Shut up and listen to me." And one of the major inventions of Freud is that he accepted. He accepted, and this is how the talking cure was born. So the two fundamental things that Freud brought was talking cure, which means the patient talks, the therapist listens, and the fact that there is a meaning to the symptom. And we have to explore that meaning. And that meaning is always very individual. So all the attempts to give names, hysterical, borderline, etc., narcissism, all these things are just ways for professionals to establish a sort of common ground where they can talk. But at the level of the individual, at the level of a disease, it is always hyper-personal.
So, if I understand well, the first women were women from the bourgeois that were accused by being hysterical.
Those are the women that got in contact with Freud. But Charcot, it was a different story.
Yeah.
Charcot, the story was that it's on the story of the asylum. People who had mental trouble were put in asylum, and basically they were left there to die. And so they had various sort of symptoms. And Charcot was working on this idea. It was floating in the air, So he started these lessons where he showed that he could extinguish the symptoms, and therefore they were not organic, by hypnosis, for example. So a woman who would come with a partial face paralysis, he would hypnotize her, she would just, and then wake up without the symptom, because she would be obeying him. But these women were very poor and abandoned women. They're the opposite of the bourgeoisie from Vienna. These women were abandoned, and the word spread. It was really like a jail, Until then, people were attached to the wall with chains.
Yes.
Okay. So the word spread among the women there, who were still sharp, in spite of the condition, that there was this doctor who was doing these demonstrations. So they started to pretend. They started to create also, and among your photos, there are quite a few that are well-known cases of pretending.
Yes.
And then there was the issue of taking photos. To take photos, as you well know, in those days was a whole thing. I mean, you brought the 4x5 camera, you had to install people, put the light on, they had to stay in the position, not to move because the time of exposure was long, etc.
Yes.
So these photos are circus.
Yes, definitely.
So this is, I think what one has to understand is that mental disease is very connected to the times in which you live. And hysteria was connected to the poor treatment of women in asylum and to the poor treatment of women in the bourgeoisie. This is the story of hysteria.
The term hysteria was actually dropped in the professional field of psychotherapy in the mid of the 20th century already. But already in 1968, it was reintroduced as histrionical personality disorder, mainly in the diagnostic of the Statistic Manual of Mental Disorder, in short, the DSM book. Yeah? Some disease pattern of hysteria have evolved to include different and various syndromes and symptoms. How do you tend to navigate in these oscillating terms? And as sometimes I also read about them as bucket terms.
They are. This is really what they are. The field of mental health is a minefield. There are so many schools, and they're all doing their best to try to help people who are suffering. Because there are so many professionals and so many different forms of sufferings, it is necessary to establish a common vocabulary. So this is what DSM, this book that you refer to, is attempting to do. It is giving definitions for all the possible disease. It's funny because before Freud arrived, in the 1880s, there was a psychiatrist called Krafft-Ebing who did exactly the same thing. He started to write down all the possible phobias. So you have the phobia of the snake, the phobia of the spider, the phobia of the light, the phobia of the dark, the phobia of the school, the phobia of the home. It's an endless thing. So in fact, this attempt to label is a lost cause. However, it tells us about the time in which we are living. And it tells us about what in fact is navigating at this unconscious or discrete level within the mental field. So hysteria etymologically is a Greek word, and it's referred to the uterus. So in other words, hysteria from the beginning, by the people who wanted to use it, was connected to sexuality. Okay? Feminine sexuality, to be precise, which in fact was a mistake, because one of the first things that Freud did after he was with Charcot and he went to Vienna, he gave a lecture, which is published, it exists, to the medical school to show what he had learned. One of the first things he said there's male hysteria and female hysteria, and he was laughed out of the place. But for Freud, it was very clear that hysteria, if there is such a thing, is not sexual specific. Okay? Today, we live in a different world. We are under the influence of the Anglo-Saxon and the Puritanism and all sorts of things like that, and sexuality has become a no-go area. So we have this new term, histrionic, whatever, personality disorder.
HPD.
Right. So histrionic is in fact comes from Latin, and it doesn't refer to sexuality. It refers to hyperactivity, uncontrollable face movement. I was histrionic. You know, if the teacher in my school had known the right term to use about me, she should have said, "You're an histrionic child, not an hysterical child." I was agitated, uncontrollable, you know, etc. That's histrionic. It's childish, overacting type of thing. So it is now, when you have falsely, again, you must understand this, when women come and they are agitated, they're going to say you have histrionic, comportamental, I don't know what story. Okay? But it's a way of saying what you're suffering from is not sexual. This is the message. Okay? And this is telling us about the society in which we live. Because from the point of view of what this woman is suffering from, or that guy, because histrionic is also guys, just like hysteria is also guys. From the question of what this person is suffering of, it is not a question of label. It is a question of the person. What is the story of that person? And there we go back to my, belief in talk therapy, in listening, and letting the story come out. And it takes a long time, okay? But this is my reaction to me, if you want, the DSM is a contemporary version of the Krafft-Ebing. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It's a lost attempt at classifying something which is infinite. What is infinite? The human condition. We all suffer in our personal ways, which are connected to our story. to our traumas.
Yeah, okay, so if we think about the contemporary use of HPD, histrionic personality disorder, we found that Charcot's 19th century hysteria, or even the emptiness of the womb, as it was believed to be the cause of hysteria in antiquity.
Yeah, you can turn it into sexual abstinence.
Yes.
This is what it means.
Yeah.
Emptiness of the womb means either you can't have a child or you don't have sex. That's, keep it simple.
Still, they are still today directly linked to HPD. So do you have a speculation for why holding on up to date into concepts that already in the 19th century suppressed women?
You're talking about hysteria?
Yes, and about HPD, still to
Well,
hold on a definition.
Okay, now that's a complex one. There are two things. First thing is that words have a life which is different from scientific knowledge. For example, I was just looking up this the other day, and I read it to you. They're idiots, imbeciles, and morons. These are things that we say to people, but we don't remember that in the 19th century, these were psychiatric classification. And there's a very precise definition of what is an idiot. An idiot is someone who has less than the intellectual level of a child of 2 years old. What's an imbecile? An imbecile is someone who has less than the intellectual level of a child of 5 years old. So an imbecile is smarter than an idiot. You have to get that right. And a moron is someone who has less than the intelligence of a 12-year-old child. So at the top of the pyramid you have the moron, that's the smartest, okay? Then you have the imbecile, then you have the idiot. But these things that we use in our common language had a meaning, and it's still in our language. It's the same with hysteria. You see a woman, for some reason she's doing something, whatever, you say she's hysterical. Just like you would say to a guy who drives across you, you're a fucking idiot. You're doing the same thing. You're using a word out of its original, precise definition. World has evolved, language has an inertia.
Yeah, lead me to my next question. That language plays a crucial role here, and within psychotherapy in general, and also did within Charcot's examinations. And from today's stand-up point, the question that he was asking his patients were very short, and eventually he chose to determine hysterical disorders by physical manifestation. And we know that what he observed could only be seen through sketches and photography. And as you said before, photography was even not 4x5, it was 8x10, and the exposure was around 5
seconds.
5 seconds, so it was definitely very much directed.
Yes.
Yeah? And my question is, do you see a similar gap? It's a complicated question. Do you see a similar gap or problem in the use of language in your practice?
Sure.
Do you learn from what is being said in your clinic through the spoken language as much as you learn from the body language that's being expressed in the clinic? And last, I imagine that in the pandemic time, you probably had a lot of Zoom session or Skype session in your case, and when the body actually is absent. So was his absent?
Noted?
Yeah.
Yes. Can I have the question? Wow. How should we start? No, I don't want to do that. How should we start? Yeah. It's the question of labeling. You know, at a certain point, you have to communicate with people. You have to communicate between professors and students. You have to communicate to the press, to the media. So you have to use words, okay? But the words are always a reduction of what the reality is. Fundamentally, we are living an alienation. We are alienated by language. Language is a translation of what we feel in our body. Language emerges from our body. This is the reason Lacan was right on a few things, but he was wrong on the fact that the unconscious is structured like a language. It isn't. The unconscious is a chaos. It is a kind of chaos we feel inside of ourselves and which frightens us about ourselves. So there is the need to give names, to communicate. But this is an alienation. It's an alienation of us, and it's an alienation of the patient. So the answer to your question is, you need the full persona to be with you in the room during analysis or therapy. And it is very clear that when patients were separated and kept in their place, and we were on Skype or on the phone or whatever, an essential dimension was lost. But we used it, because you can use everything, we used it.
Mm-hmm. So for you it's crucial.
The presence?
Yeah.
Fundamental. The presence, the secret, fundamental. The patient has to be very, very confident that this is not going out of this place. Because what is happening in this place is something that happens nowhere else in life. It's two people talking about one. That in your daily life never happens. I'm talking to you, I look at your face, your eyes, I'm like, does she understand what I'm saying? Am I right? Am I wrong? Does she agree? Is she going to hit me with another question? It is troubling me in my talking. Mm-hmm. I'm all the time adapting to you. The moment the patient is lying down, which is kind of the ideal position with the analyst behind, he can talk and he will only hear himself or the few interpretations, and the subject will be only the patient. At no point should the analyst say, oh yeah, that remembers a story, yesterday I was with someone who told me this and that. This is why I don't understand what psychoanalysts are doing on television. Because from the point of view of the patient, this is an intrusion. There's only one way out, because it happened to me, I was called to television a few times, is you warn the patient. You have to do that. You say to the patient, on such and such a time, on such and such channel, I will be interviewed. Is it okay with you? And if the patient says no, you call the TV and you say, I'm sorry. Because this is, of course, because the priority is the patient. This is what it's all about. But most of the patients say, yeah, I want to see on TV. Show you to my wife or whatever.
Let's skip this one. So during this pandemic and the global rise of poverty, expressions such as mass hysteria are commonly used, especially in the media.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestion on how to use those terms today, or do we maybe need a linguistic reform in the field, or maybe it's a new manipulation of the drug and insurance company before they publish a new anxiety drug for us?
Yeah, certainly. But about should we have a modification of language, we should call this group behavior. This is crowd group behavior. It has nothing to do with hysteria. But using hysteria about this is like saying to someone, you're an idiot. When you're trying to say you don't understand what I'm telling you, but you're not saying to that person, you have the mental age of a 2-year-old child. You understand? So to use the word hysteria about the mass behavior is a wrong use of the word.
And what do you mean when you say group behavior?
Well, group behavior is something that has been studied and analyzed, and we know a lot about it. What happens in groups is that the superego, this is this instance. Okay, I'm talking from my point of view, okay? I'm a Freudian contemporary psychoanalyst, so I'm using superego. There are different perspectives. As far as I'm concerned, whatever work is fine, okay? But this is my perspective. So in the crowd, what happens is the surveilling instance in our mind, which is the superego, which comes from what our parents taught us, what civilization taught us, how to behave, how to respect the 10 Commandments. Okay? This is the superego. Mm-hmm. In the crowd, the level of activity of the superego goes down dramatically. So people do whatever the crowd does. And that's the reason, because the superego goes down so dramatically, that in fact they're in quest for a leader. This is why crowds get Hitler. This is why crowds get Trump. Because they generate, by the mass behavior, the kind of guy that appears. And what is he? He's a crazy superego. This is what he is. And this is what the crowd needs. You know, there's a dialectic between the crowd and the leader. You get the leaders you deserve. They don't appear out of nowhere. 75 million of Americans voted for him.
This is a long one, but it troubles me. Only after facial paralysis, which was mentioned as a possible side effect of Pfizer vaccine, also has been seen in men, Professor Rahav concluded that the cause wasn't female hysteria. Maybe some of you read it in Haaretz newspaper not long ago. So Professor Dalia Yaha from the Sheba Hospital talks about new phenomena discovered in Israel following the corona vaccines that might cause paralysis of the facial nerves. And it's not yet clear if this is directly linked to the vaccine, but Pfizer didn't know about that. And Rahav said, and I quote, "So, at first they talked about it being hysterical women only, but probably not, because we've already seen it in men too. And I do believe it's real. Isn't it incredible and unbearable?" And then I continue, women continue to face doctors who dismiss their complaint under the claim of hysteria or exaggeration, and we hear it from a gynecologist to doctor who sent woman home with a blood clot, claiming that she is acting hysterically, and so on. And I'm asking myself that if Professor Rahav, a woman in a senior medical position, and the member of Pfizer do not see, our situation is pretty bad.
Yeah,
No?
well, with all due respect to Professor Rahav, I don't know what's her specialty.
She's the senior in the department of Shiva Hospital for disease.
Of disease.
Viral disease.
Viral disease. She should stick to that, okay? There's no reason to use the word hysteria in this thing, unless she's a Freudian without knowing it, you know. She sees a partial paralysis of the face, and she says, this is, you know, a conversion, so this is hysteria. And it's a woman, so it's logical. So she's a Freudian, but she's a bad Freudian, because Freud, as I told you, said it's both masculine and feminine. So that's wrong. But in any case, you are in charge of the Department of Medicine, and you have a patient who develops a partial paralysis following an injection. What's the first thing you do? You send him to do an MRI, because you have to evacuate the possibility that there is a blood clot. Okay? And only after can you contemplate the possibility that maybe there is some nervous disorder here, and let's listen to the woman and not label her. Sit down, tell us your story. She probably doesn't have time, send her to me. Okay?
Last question for you.
That's
yeah.
you know that this is
About it later.
this is what I have with patients. It's like hunting for pearls. You wait and you wait and you wait until something happens. And the things that we love are lapses, which you just did. And your lapses now was my questions.
Yeah.
So these are your questions. They're not for me. They're addressed to you.
Yes, it's because...
Very much so.
Yes. I think it's my anxiety underneath to hold the format.
I think it's your anxiety, and I think it's also your justified rage at the mislabeling of women.
Yeah.
And you're right. You see, idiot is not such a prevalent thing, but hysterical is a very, as a child I was told you were hysterical.
You see,
I wasn't called a moron.
We have collective memory, for sure.
Yeah.
It's been generated even through different lives.
Right. So the other things we're waiting for with patients are lapses, dreams, transference, free association, which is talking, which is the patient doesn't know what the hell he's going to be talking about. So many times patients arrive and they say, I got here, I wanted to talk to you about this, and I found myself talking about that, and I'm at the end talking about a third thing. And I say, great, just let it go. Okay.
That's why you didn't want to know anything about the questions?
Yeah.
So, you held 2 lectures at the CCA in 2018 and the other one in 2019, entitled Contemporary Psychoanalysis and New Ways to Look at Art. Could you maybe read my series Mousework in the sense of contemporary psychoanalysis?
Yes, but you would have to talk to me. I would be listening to you. But what I can tell you something already. This is, all your works here are the closest thing I have seen to the representation, I talk about the central image, to a representation of dreams. You have taken things that you found and you put them together, and it's like, as if there is a secret code. You know, why is this horse here with this basketball player? What's the connection? There is a meaning. You know? And so Freud, when he met the surrealists, because Dali went to see him, he made his portrait in London, and Breton went to see him. By the way, Breton fainted. He was like super impatient to see Freud. The door opened, comes a little old man, Breton, faints. But what Freud said about the surrealists is that they taught him more about their conscious than about their unconscious. Because it's so formatted, you know, all these paintings of Dali, they have nothing to do with our experience of dreams. Our experience of dreams is something, even the idea of an image is disputed, but it's something which is condensed, displaced, it's a cipher. And to unpack it, you have to let the patient freely associate. Why the horse? You know, talk to me about the horse. What's the connection between the basketball guy and the horse? I can think of one, they're both black. Was that the one you had in mind? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But these things really function as dreams. That's one thing I wanted to tell you about your exhibition. And the other thing I wanted to tell you is about the movie that you're showing. What is it called? Arachno something?
Taranta dance.
Taranta?
Dance.
Taranta dance. Taranta, in fact, is a spider.
Yes, tarantula.
Tarantula. So maybe to conclude, we're gonna do it. If you look at, has everybody seen that little movie? If you don't, go and see it after. So there is this woman lying on the floor. It's a woman from a village, a peasant woman. And around her are men playing instruments. And she enters into a trance. And she's like dancing like this on the floor, always lying down on the floor. Okay? And they say, when you ask them, well, what's the story here? They say, well, it's, you know, in the old days, a woman got bitten by a spider, and this is how we cure her. We do this, and it's become. Now, from a psychoanalytical thing, you can unpack this thing. If I ask you, I will answer, don't worry. If I ask you, what does this woman lying on the floor going like this remind you of? This is a woman in orgasm. This is sexual activity. There's no other possible thing. Now, there was a psychoanalyst who was the favorite psychoanalyst of Freud. It was a guy called Karl Abraham. He was in Berlin. Freud considered him to be the most intelligent of all. He died very young. But he proposed an idea with the phobia of the spider. Okay? It would be in the DSM or in the Kraftebing as one of the... No, but he says, wait a minute. What's a spider? Spider is a body like this, with members, you know, like arms, legs, whatever, that are hairy and going in all sorts of directions. Okay? What is this? What are we looking at? And he says, what we're looking at and is freaking us out is a primal scene. It is the parents making love seen from the point of view of a baby. It is a terribly frightening thing for a child. Okay? And it used to happen a lot because people lived in small places. Well, if there's a child, it means the mother is in the age of being pregnant, so she's making love with her husband. So the child is bound to see one way or another. So the spider, the phobia of the spider, is the phobia of the primal scene. So this is really, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, you know, it's very intelligent, that's for sure. But the fact that this dance of a love-making woman with a ghost, okay, the guy is not there. She's just doing this by herself. They say the origin of this is a spider. I say this is fantastic. I rest my case.
They still do it till today.
Yeah.
In church.
In church, yeah. That's perfect.
Should we maybe open
Sure.
for question if somebody has comments?
Yes. Should we give him the microphone or something?
Yes, one moment.
Not this one, not this one. There's another one. Yeah, we have Talmud students. Where's the second microphone? And this is rocket science.
Thank you for this talk and bringing those subjects to our understanding. I was going to ask you one thing. You touched upon it a little bit describe the imbecile role and how this vocabulary or these terms are slipped into the vocabulary of the common vocabulary.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to read out my questions a little bit here, if you don't mind. And so you define the categories of psychoanalysis as an agreed common ground to help us, to help or else support psychoanalysts to diagnose their patients. And how did the term come to be common use, and how do you, from a psychoanalyst point of view, look at the slipping of the meaning from? Did you get it? Yeah. Okay.
It's always the same story. Bring the patient back to his personal experience with his own words. Get out of labels. The labels are an alienation, but they are super alienation. They are needed. We understand why they are needed. Okay? They're needed to teach, they're needed to communicate, that's all fine. But when you have someone suffering, if he's on the couch and he said, this Milman, it's really terrible, I am a borderline narcissistic case, and say, let's talk about it. What do you understand? What does it mean to you to be this? The label is hiding the forest.
Yeah, but I was wondering more about really this slipping of using the same term within the clinic, let's say, or within an hospital, or which is a very no, it's a controlled environment where the terminology is very important and specific. So let's say in your clinic or and then using the same term outside of the clinic, just as you said, you call someone an imbecile without knowing that once it was a category. Yeah. Now we're using hysterical also as a common word, and I'm really wondering about the sleeping, this way of thing is. Yeah.
There's only one thing I can tell you is that language has an inertia. Language has an inertia in contact to science. And science is much further ahead very often. Even when people say everything is relative, okay, that's a common thing. Everything is relative. How many people can actually explain relativity? So language doesn't really reflect knowledge. There's an attempt which is more or less controlled, and it is very controlled within the hospital, because here you have patients, they're sick, people have to understand, etc. But talking about COVID, I think we saw blatantly that they misunderstand each other. They're like, what are you saying? I don't understand what you're saying. They completely disagree. So even in science, in medicine, language is a problem.
And how do you see this? Because there is a disconnection at one point. So then we still use hysterical, you can call anyone hysterical, but maybe and probably, as we have heard, it's not something that anymore you use in professional as a professional part of your professional terminology. So then there is this disconnection between the root of the term and this common use. And how do you look at this disconnection? This term having his own life, also kind of.
I have the impression that I kind of answered that.
Yes, you did.
I don't want to rehash. I'd rather something else.
I was wondering if there's any connection, or I'm sure there's a connection. What do you think the connection between narcissism and psychoanalysis, as far as
Becoming what?
Shrinks or psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, if narcissists are attracted
To the profession?
to the profession.
Of
And
course.
if they can succeed, if it actually feeds the narcissism.
Okay, listen, if that's the reason they're attracted to it, they're going to be in trouble. Because if they're not capable, Freud's position, by the way, was that a patient with narcissism cannot be cured. Because fundamentally, the psychoanalytic liaison, if you want, is based on transference. Transference means that you're projecting on the person of the analyst something from your past. You think he's like a father or like a mother, but you acknowledge his existence as an object. It's just that you make a mistake. You think it's your father, in fact it's your therapist. Okay? You just make a mistake. But you're not narcissistic. If you're fundamentally narcissistic, you don't acknowledge the presence of anyone except yourself. So, if there are psychoanalysts, psychiatrists is a different story. But if there are psychoanalysts who are narcissistic, they are in trouble.
Yeah, I thought that Freud was kind of like a had narcissistic tendencies. No.
All sorts of things were said about Freud, and he was a lover of the sister of his wife, and he took cocaine, and what not, I think the fundamental problem is that he brought sexuality at the center of the picture, and that drove everybody crazy. Just look at the way he was welcomed in Vienna when he arrived from Paris in chapeau, and he says, hysteria is sexual, man and woman, out of the society. People don't want to hear that. So, not a recommendation, narcissism. I gave you the example of television. If I'm asked to do an interview, and if I'm a narcissist, I'm going to say, yeah, sure. The patient, I don't give a damn. I'm a narcissist. No. You have to call your patient. The priority is the patient. I think, that proves it.
Don't you think there's some attraction to profession for people who, I'm not saying that just by nature of being a psychoanalyst, you have the ability to control your patient, but there is
able to what?
To control your patient.
No, you're not.
No, but I think that's maybe an implied.
If anybody is controlled, it's the analyst by the patient. The patients are teaching you things, and they're teaching you things the hard way. And this is the reason why it is very much encouraged in the Society of Psychoanalysis for the therapists to talk between each other to get it out. They are the target. They are the target of the projection of the transference of everything. So, no. And to talk about this, I'm not sure that statistically there is a higher prevalence of narcissism in psychoanalysis when compared to captains of industry. But here is the thing, it's all on the psychoanalyst. There is a very interesting work to do, which is the treatment of psychoanalysts in movies. It's incredible. They're all murderers, perverts, and every time I think, okay, what this means is that the guy who wrote that script is acting out his vengeance against his analyst.
So when you get a patient from another psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, you don't read the backside of the book, you don't have a definition, you don't work with definitions at all.
The less, the better. But when I'm telling you, we have to speak between ourselves, between the psychoanalysts, to get things out.
Do you use
Sometimes we do, but when we do, we have to run away from it and to stick with the experience of the patient, the words of the patient. No patient is going to say to you, I'm suffering of being a borderline. That's not what the patients say.
Is there any connection between the need of those definitions and insurance companies?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, because there is now this invention of molecules. They are helpful. They're not paradise. The best results in the very serious cases are achieved through combination of pills and therapy. These are statistically the best results. It's better than just chemicals. But then these chemicals have to be sold, and they have to be promoted, and they have to be advertised. And these guys, they don't have an ethical problem. They have a financial problem. They want to sell their stuff. So they're going to do whatever is needed. So if there is something against, what did you call it, AHC? What was it called, HAC?
Personality,
histrionic,
HPD. Yeah.
HPD, okay, yeah. HPD, whatever. So if there is something against HPD, they're going to show you an image of a screaming woman, like the one you selected.
Yeah.
You know, to get the message across.
Yeah.
But this is also an alienation. You know, the objective of this thing is to sell the product.
Yeah.
It's not to tell you the truth. This is financial based. You know, I mean, there's one thing I can tell you: if you want to make money, don't become a psychoanalyst. Because there's only so many patients you can see, and there's only so much money you can ask for. That's not the route to money.
Yeah, this is one of the, yeah. Go
So
ahead.
I'm sorry to bring it back to art, but as I hope many people here, I see psychoanalysts as people with kind of a superpower of understanding what happens between us. What I was wondering about, for me, when I look at the work of art, it either gives me an insight into the world or an insight into myself. And what I was wondering about, if for you it is an insight automatically into the artist itself, as you understand it, have a way in to understanding people better than us, or do you actually experience it as we do?
No. Analysis only happens in the setting. 3 times a week, on the couch, confidential. This is where it takes place. When I arrive here and I look at this, I am like you. I am exactly like you. And what in me is like you, I protect. Because I need it. Because I need art just like you. You know, and no interpretation is going to help me. But when Ilit says to me, you know, I would like you to give a lecture, then all of a sudden, okay, now I have a problem. I have to start to try to unpack this work and try to communicate something. But my personal experience, same as yours.
Well, I'm happy for you because I enjoy my experience very much.
Great. So we agree, and I'm also happy for myself.
This is not exactly the same topic, but the presentation is exquisite, the format. Was that from the beginning that you wanted to present your work in, you know, like the window and it can be closed and private? I mean, you have a feeling of looking into something very private going on. Was there a process of coming up with this format?
In the studio, we work in a team. So we have like researcher, and I do the photographs and part of the research. And the frame, the sculpture itself is a collaboration with artist Jonathan Twito, and he's here. Maybe he can talk a little bit about the process. Yes, maybe you can talk a little bit about the process of making the frame and about the connections to the process, the industrial process of vacuum forming and the drug companies.
Yeah, I think just a sentence or two on how it was made. So there was a process of production process, starting from a sketch and a 3D sketch on the computer, and then from there it was sent to a production house, factory. Plastic we chose was a very specific plastic. It's used for making cases. Sometimes to uncase things so they don't get broken. And then, so at the other end of this factory process, we got those frames, which is usually, you might know how frames are being made, they are really custom made, very carefully. And these cartoons, it's radically different in a way that it's being made really 200 of them were made at once. The diamond case is very fragile and image. And the conflict between them, or from my point of view, was nice to discover that when we arrived here because we haven't seen that when it happened, the whole production. So when we arrived here, we really were witnessing that for the first time. So
It just works so perfectly with the spine and this intimacy that you're getting into.
yeah, I think in a way it really refers to this family frame that you get sometimes that they have in Europe,
Right.
and you get this idea of
Very good, very good.
easy ways to look at it, but it's sometimes helps to have this memory reference.
Daniel, thank you. I was also wondering, do you have a take on how this pandemic and the children, what people are saying about how the children are reacting now from being in isolation?
I know about the situation in France. Not so much about here, but in France, the prevalence of depression and suicidal thoughts among children between 5 and 15 has risen so dramatically that Macron himself announced 2 days ago that the state is funding 10 sessions of therapy for children between 5 and 15 who want it. So it is a huge thing.
Yeah.
10 sessions. That's ridiculous.
It's something, it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
You know, at least you get out of home. Okay?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.